Hey guys, Chris here, and I am a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is January 31st, 2023. Let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? Before I dive deep into the map first, I wanted to discuss one quick topic, which I think is really important, and that is why has Russia picked up the initiative in the last few weeks, and why has Ukraine kind of lost it? I think it's really important to discuss that. And I think that this stems from two factors that I personally underestimated. And number one, that is the mobilization, which has had a very positive impact for the Russian army. They have managed to mobilize over 300,000 soldiers. And essentially, they've managed to plug in all these holes in their defenses. So we're all riding high last year in late 2022, following all these successful counteroffensives that Ukraine had in Kharkiv and Kherson. And the feeling was, at least for me, that Ukraine would be able to steamroll through Svatove and Kremina. It was just a matter of a couple weeks. But as we have seen, that isn't the case. And Russia has successfully been able to defend up until now these major cities in Donbass. And so, number one, I think personally, I underestimated this mobilization and how the Russians were able to really plug in all their lines. And number two is I also underestimated that the Russians were completely okay to be used as cannon fodder. As you might have seen, on a daily basis, they're attacking Bakhmut right now through various waves of attack. And the Russian soldiers are completely okay with that. The Wagner, the mobilized soldier, they have zero problem with that. It seems like there's no opposition to it, and they're accepting their fate as cannon fodder, which is obviously very exhaustive for the Ukrainians because now they have to defend themselves against waves and hordes of Russian soldiers, and that exhausts any defenders. The amount of artillery you need to use, the ammo, the logistical lines that need to be constantly resupplied. It's really tiring, and I think that these two factors alone are the main reason why the Ukrainians have kind of lost the initiative recently. And let me know what you think about these two factors. Now, if we're looking at the map, Bakhmut right now is not looking that great. Following my previous video, the Russians managed to grab a little bit more territory south of Bakhmut, as you can see here. They're now very close to the hill that is close to the highway leading to Bakhmut. As you can see here, this is south in Klishivka. So they're now in control of, partial control of this first hill here. The Ukrainians cannot allow them to get into this highway close to Ivanivske. If that happens, this puts them in a very critical position. They only have one safe road now that they can utilize to resupply their forces in Bakhmut. So that's not looking good. And the other situation is in Krasna Hora, where the Ukrainians that are holding this settlement here are, very close to being encircled. And so I think that, as I've said in the previous video, they might have to pull out of here. So Bakhmut is not looking good. And let's pray that the Ukrainian forces are going to be able to really hold their ground until they get more resupply. They get resupplied, and more vehicles coming through and more artillery to be able to push back the Russians. And the other thing I wanted to discuss is the fact that in the previous video as well, I mentioned that the Institute of War was talking about the fact that the Russians are planning this massive counteroffensive, and their main axis, their main front that they want to open up again is LYMAN. And I think that makes complete sense. And why that makes sense is because if you guys remember as well, before this offensive in Kharkiv, the successful one from the Ukrainian side, where they managed to really grab all this territory that you see here, the front lines were here in LYMAN. The Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces were fighting in the forests of LYMAN and Raihorodok. And so why back then the Russians were fighting here is because they wanted to get into Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. These two cities are key. They're the last remaining big cities in Donbass. And together, they had a pre-war population of about 300,000 people. And that's why it's really important. Kramatorsk also has an airport, a regional airport that the Ukrainians are probably using to resupply their forces in Bakhmut and all the other settlements on the front lines. So this is why I believe the Russians are probably going to go all in LYMAN and try to push the Ukrainian forces into Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. We'll see how successful they're going to be, but that makes sense to me. And the other offensive that the Russians have opened up is in Vuhledar. Right now, it's still inconclusive, but you can see that it's so far the Russians have been incapable of pushing through Vuhledar. Again, the main reason is because they want to really encircle the Ukrainians from the back here. They have struggled so much in the past 8 years at pushing the Ukrainian forces out of Donetsk city. These lines here that you see are from 2014, and they have been incapable of pushing the Ukrainians out of here because obviously Donetsk is like the capital of Donbass, and so they don't want to have the Ukrainian forces so close of Donetsk city. So their strategy is to push the Ukrainians out of Vuhledar, being able to encircle them from the back here, and really make the Ukrainian positions collapse from Donetsk city. So far, their gains have been negligible, if none at all. They've had disastrous losses here, with multiple videos confirming that. But again, as I've said, the number two factor is that we have been underestimated, that the Russians are okay with dying for even an inch of gained territory. So that's it for the map. Now let's get into the other slides. And the other slide is, I guess you can call it a major scandal in Russia, but I think it's being kind of quieted down back in the Kremlin. But the TV presenter of a famous Russian state TV channel called NTV, her name was Olga Zenkova, and she was sent to Melitopol to do propaganda piece. And while visiting a restaurant there, she was unfortunately, and yes, I think it's unfortunate because this shouldn't be happening to anyone, that she was raped by Kadyrov's nephew, apparently, and the cameraman was also beat up. So it's atrocious, and I wouldn't wish this to my biggest enemies. But unfortunately, this is what happens. This is a taste of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and you reap what you sow. If you can only imagine, as I've written here, if they were doing it to their own people, to their own Russian people, you can only imagine the atrocities they've been committing to the Ukrainian people in these occupied territories. I'm not looking forward to seeing these stories that we've already been witnessing in Bucha, in occupied Kherson city, in Irpin, of the atrocities that the Russian army has committed on the Ukrainian people. So it's insane. It's barbarous. It's savage. But that's the Russian world, and that's why Ukraine is fighting against it. And also a little taste of the Russian world in Russia. A married couple that was harshly detained in a restaurant that is called Nadrovach, because they had a private conversation in which anti-war statements were made. And so people in that restaurant called the police to arrest them. And so the security forces came, they put the spouses on the floor, handcuffed them, and took them into the Department of Internal Affairs for questioning. And I think the woman was later released, but not much clarification was given for the father. So, Russia never stopped its Soviet traditions, right? The gulags, albeit they don't exist now, but they're in the form of the prisons, and they really want to ensure that nobody talks against the government. And you can see that's a perfect representation of daily events in Russia. And this also shows you that there's still, decent people in Russia that are opposed to this war, but they're a minority. They're a minority. This is a video. I think his name is Mardan. He also has his own little, hour of fame on the state television. And it's kind of funny because to this day, almost a year in, they still don't want to admit that this is a real war in Ukraine. And so this is an obvious cognitive dissonance, but let's hear what he has to say here. So Russians are now threatening Ukraine with nuclear weapons. Russians are not threatening Ukraine with nuclear weapons. Russians have made it clear from the very beginning what this conflict means to Russia, what Ukraine means to Russia, and how far Russia is ready to go in this war, if a real war will begin. So far, it's not a war. Really, it's not a war. So you can see here that after a year in, they still call it a special military operation. But why have we seen this narrative constantly being told by these propaganda anchors? Well, because they're trying to avoid calling it a war because it legitimizes Ukraine's power and Ukraine's opposition to Russia. They don't want to admit that Ukraine actually is a match against Russia and that Ukrainians actually don't want to have anything to do with Russia, right? It's admitting that they're losing this war, admitting that actually all these stories that Ukrainians want liberation are actually fictitious, are fiction, and that actually the Ukrainians don't want Russian liberation, and Ukraine actually wants sovereignty and democracy and doesn't want to have a single part of Russia with Russia. So you can see here that it's a cognitive dissonance because, in fact, everything that Russia has done the last year is a war, yet they still call it a special military operation. And last but not least is another piece of Russian propaganda, and this time is Kisilyov. He has his, daily evening shows talking about how terrible it is in the West, and here he's talking about how Europe's culture is collapsing. So let's see. Europe's cultural transformation has been underway for a long time, and of course, it has a domestic dimension. People are being asked to do their laundry less often, to use household appliances less, to wash less, to lower the temperature inside at home and at work. And now they're also being advised to eat insects. French cuisine may become unrecognizable very soon, and Italian cuisine too. Bavarian sausage will become somehow indecent, and British steak will become politically incorrect. The European Commission is working hard for this, officially permitting shops to sell that which previously wasn't even considered as food. But now, as it turns out, insects, bugs, and worms are the new words in cookery and on restaurant menus. So I think this really portrays the jealousy that Russia has over the West, right? They want to portray on a daily basis to the Russian population that the West can be happier than us. They can be better than us. Look at how, they've introduced insects into their, into their daily meals and things like that. It's a pure jealousy that Russia's always expressed. And now they're going full on, PR mode on this, displaying that, Europe is struggling. Look how good we have it here in Russia, and that the Europeans are going to be, what's the word I'm looking for? They're going to be regretting this. They're regretting the fact that they're trying to sever their connection with Russia and that we're this great Russian nation. It's really pity to see it in action, but you can see here that this is what Russians are watching on a daily basis. This is hours and hours of propaganda that is being, pretty much shoved into their brains. And it's reversible at this point. It's irreversible. So that's it, guys. That's the update for today. I hope that you enjoyed my video. Please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me to motivate me to make more videos for you guys. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you for your support.